Dave can comment on the work that was done on that space if you'd like.
Yep.
So initially we were given technical input, so what form of RPS or mitigation structure, where it could be sited, how long it was, how big it was. Then I cost that, and that structure had to be capable of reducing the risk to 10 to the -4.
Yep.
We had some confidence that it could. Then in the case of a fence, because it requires replacement and maintenance over its lifetime, that had to be factored in the whole of life cost. Also, GNS models indicate that there will be rockfall over the next 50 years, so there was an allowance for damage over that period. Access, it's a large structure, and it's a structure that can take multiple impacts, and it's an engineered structure, and the costs that this is based on are based on like McAfee or GeoVert costs for rockfall protection fences, and that's. Is there anything else?
I mean, you say that it's based on the GeoVert and McAfee costs. So, because we all got a letter from the local member of parliament yesterday, and she in fact quotes from them as saying the rockfall protection in the Port Hills was both realistic and achievable. And she suggested that the scenario was quite different in terms of the geotech and mechanical engineering solution, far less challenging in terms of the one that's being proposed and costed in this paper.
Well, GeoVert did a study, I think, on Avoca Valley, but it was a sector-wide study, and it was technically capable, and they did examine that. We're not saying it's not technically possible, but in this small area with a short length fence, a large fence, a number of boulders, this is what it would cost based on McAfee and GeoVert costs.
So it really is because of the few properties that are now protected, because the vast bulk of them are owned by Sarah. So that's
quite a key
the difference.
element. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, Phil.
All right, could I just interrupt just really quickly? I think the other thing to remember in Phil's case, and it would apply elsewhere, is the difference between individual property protection versus area-wide. So you're looking at a completely different issue where you're designing something to specifically protect one property versus trying to deal with several at a time. And again, Dave's point about the scale, it's changed from whole suburb down to a small number of houses, and that definitely affects the overall costs.
Yeah, so the economics are affected by that, but on an individual basis, we already have policy in place to assist on the individual basis. Phil.
Thank you. So just from what we've been discussing, it's becoming pretty clear that the decision by the Crown to not allow the Sarah land or the red zone land to be used for access, that's impacted on the recommendations in your report and the decisions?
The access isn't an issue. I mean, I think the Minister remains open to access, but certainly the key one is not allowing Sarah properties to, not contemplating Sarah-owned land being reoccupied or put back to the market if these things are put in place is probably the key. And the second is certainly an unwillingness, it would seem, from the Crown to say we are not prepared to accept the inherent liability of having these structures on Crown land. So those are probably the two significant
It might be
drivers.
useful to table the letter from Sarah.
So I think, that was emailed, but I think Claire has that letter.
Yeah, it was emailed last night, yesterday afternoon, but I think that's quite a helpful letter to understand the Crown's position on that. So in terms of access, Sarah has a process in place around interim use of residential red zone land, and the council is able to apply for temporary access across Crown-owned land via this existing process. Sarah is unable to guarantee that ongoing access will be available after decisions about the future use and ownership of the residential red zone land are made. So it's actually a bit of a double whammy, really, because yes, you might get permission for access, but that may not be an ongoing right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, I thought Claire had it. My apologies, Claire. I thought you had that.
I was also,
yeah,
I've got
Phil,
some other questions,
sorry.
and like, there are some assumptions in the report, which you state are assumptions, and like you explained before that if the cost-benefit ratios were only applied if there was more than one, I understood more than one property, but there's no costings specifically in the report that actually help us understand the actual cost benefit, and especially to individual properties. So can you perhaps let us know, why are they not included?
Well, they're available. They won't be down to individual properties because, again, this was this was around area-wide mitigation. So we won't be able. So you're looking at the group of properties that are potentially protected by a piece of work and what's the benefit-cost ratios for them. But we can supply the tables that summarise that to you.
I think that'd be useful.
I think that would be useful too.
The other thing I was going to ask you too is that in terms of, and we've referred before to GeoVert and McFerry and their views, and you've indicated that they tested another part, was it Avoca Valley they looked at. But what I'm wondering is that, like my understanding is that views among geotech people vary. So, in the report, there's no reference really to other sort of peer-reviewed articles to back up, and that's not to take away from your combined considerable experience and expertise. But the report doesn't actually give us confirmation about the views that you've come to.
Well, perhaps I'll get Don to talk about that, because obviously we have our own geotech experts. We have URS and Don who led the analysis, but that involved the wider, whatever you call yourselves?
Port Hills. Geotech.
So perhaps Don could explain the sort of the consensus and approach that was adopted.
Maybe I could start by saying that what we were doing was, and we back up a little bit. There's no doubt that there are technically viable solutions out there. I mean, we're not disputing McAfee or GeoVert's view that you can do it. The problem that we have is, can you do it? Because of the land ownership issues and access issues and all the other things that go with it. So the question of the technical side of it, I don't think there's really an issue there. We're not disagreeing at all that the methodologies are there. It's just that if you can't get at the land, you're not allowed to use the land. CEO owns the properties, so you're not going to protect them. Those are really the issues that make the difference.
Yeah.
We were not charged with a rigorous analysis of anything. Is it viable to do this? And the question was, the answer was yes, technically it's viable, but the properties are actually not available to do it to. So that's really the bottom line of that whole assessment.
And it's the cost benefit as well.
Yeah, well, the cost benefit doesn't stack up, so
No.
so few properties.
Yeah.
If there were more properties, that might have made a difference.
Well, I think, until we see the numbers, I can't go the next step, because it sounds to me, based on the evidence that we heard before, is that it would make a difference if all of those properties were available. It would be financially viable.
Yeah. So
Sorry, I would like to pass it, and again, maybe this is a personal comment.
No.
But be aware that when GeoVert and McAfee are putting up these ideas, they are commercial entities who have a vested interest in the outcome. So be mindful of that.
No, I understand that, but there are figures that essentially that we're relying on, and if all of the properties were available to be protected, that hadn't been red zoned, for example, I mean, say they were all privately owned, then it would stack up on that cost-benefit analysis.
Dave might need to comment on that.
And some sub-areas within the suburbs stacked up in the cost-benefit analysis when we looked at the whole of the Port Hills.
Yep.
Not all, some weren't technically capable of being protected, some weren't viable in the cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
But yeah, there were more areas that were technically capable and would stack up in cost-benefit analysis in the beginning before the
Okay. It might actually be useful to have a list of those areas as well. Sorry, Phil, last question for you.
Only one question, and it's just on the last page of the report, which is the attachment. There's the the summary with the cost benefit.
Yeah.
One of the notes refers to that the ownership, this was for the future maintenance, I guess, ownership model was unclear for the protection structures on other property. Who would own the land, the structure, and who would maintain it? What I want to know is, was that actually discussed with the owners and taken into account in terms of the costings? For example, could the costings not have included an agreement, a legal agreement with the owners, and in fact they might be responsible for maintaining the mitigation structure?
That's my note. To be honest, that's a note of an excluded uncertainty. So if there are legal costs, they'll add to the cost. There's a note for future if rockfall protection structure is located on council land, but it's protecting an individual's property. If it requires maintenance of its lifetime, that was the issue, whether the private individual would be accessing council land to maintain their structure on council property.
Was that discussed with the owners?
No.
Because the community approach was requested that it should be considered.
Well, I mean, we discussed it with the primary owner, who is largely the Crown, because most of where this is either has to be. One of the things we said, we had to locate it in the location that was most viable, offered the best protection. That's either largely on the individual who's the beneficiary of that, or in some instances being the Crown. I'm not sure that there are a large number of third-party owners who are part of that discussion. So can I just comment on you asked quickly earlier about the area, the sort of the earlier macro look at the whole of the Port Hills. Of course, that was done in 2012 by council working with the Crown. And the minister in that instance decided not to pursue area-wide mitigation for some of the matters that Dave outlined. That there were some beneficiaries, but there were a large number of areas where it still wouldn't stack up.
It's interesting because I wonder whether some of the differences in the costs have come into not costing in the life cycle. So that I wonder if people have looked at, on one side just the cost of erecting the structure, but not actually taken into account the fact that it's got an ongoing life that needs to be maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk to the consultants and even people who come with pre-apps, their costs come from the consultants, which is a build cost, how much costs to get the structure there. Invariably, they don't consider the maintenance, ongoing costs, third-party land ownership, etc. And these are probably the costs that start spiralling up.
Yeah.
The maintenance is a big issue, cost-wise, and obviously liabilities on who takes those on. And that will obviously have a big driver in the cost that the consultants don't, and the construction Macaferries don't necessarily see or understand.
So, and you said, Mike, in your presentation before that there were some properties that were not... or there was some failure of fences because they hadn't been properly maintained?
Well, again, perhaps the geotechs can talk to that better than I can, but yes, my understanding is there's some evidence in the earthquakes that fences hadn't been maintained or weren't designed to a level, certainly weren't designed to a level to cope with the earthquakes we experienced, but perhaps Don could comment.
Really, we saw quite a number of fences that failed, but almost invariably the design was not what we would consider an adequate design in this day and age. They were, in most cases, too rigid, so a rockfall fence is designed to absorb energy, so it deforms quite a lot when the rocks hit. Most of the fences that were out there were not designed to deform, so basically the rocks hit them and either went straight through them or knocked them over.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Paul is next.
A lot of my questions have now been answered, but it's going back to the GeoVert and Macaferry, considering there is actually a difference of opinion. Have we spoken to them? Have our staff actually spoken to these two groups? And if not, why not?
Maybe if we just go back to history, the time that GeoVert was doing the report, there was a lot of interaction and discussion. Macaferry we've talked to many, many times about these things. I think the point that Ian raised, the key is that they didn't really think of the long-term cost. They give you the build cost, and they can tell you that it's really cost effective to build it, but there's a lot of other factors that they would not have taken into account because it was not part of the brief. GeoVert, for example, the SERA brief to them was very high level, and they're being quoted as gospel when really they did a very high level assessment.
Yep, but that considered, did you guys get together and talk that through with them?
We talked things through, but remember that in the end it was SERA who made the decisions. They commissioned the work, they made the final decisions. We all talked about it, we all raised the sorts of factors that came up as long-term costs and so on, but what SERA chose to do with the GeoVert report was what SERA chose to do with it, not what we might have recommended.
I think the MP raised this in her letter, that it was included in one of the cabinet papers. It says an invitation, well, a suggestion that we invite GeoVert and Macquarie, cited in the cabinet papers as having done the required work in this area, to make a presentation to council. But I don't know that that's going to help us, although it might assist us in actually teasing out this wider issue of whether the life cost was factored into their calculations. Yep.
And so I've based my costs off build costs that they supplied.
Yep.
So they have given us costs that we've used as some contingency, a couple of other consents,
yep,
legal, everything else. So we have got their costs and built the life cycle model on them. We've discussed maintenance regimes, how often it needs to be replaced. I don't think there's any real dispute between the work we've done and what they've said in the past.
Right. Yanni.
Just, it seems to me that there's the area-wide mitigation, then there's the more localised mitigation. The vacant sections are one of the outstanding issues in the Port Hills red zone. Don't think they've had offers. People, obviously, if the government does what they've done on the flat, lose a lot of their equity. So have you looked at vacant sections in terms of the, more localised mitigation solutions?
No. Firstly, they're not available to have a red zone offer. So we don't have, council has no potential liability in respect of those, because our liability is in respect of those that have had red zone offers. And I suppose there is a fundamental and a difficult question that actually says, should we, from a policy sense, be continuing to encourage development in those areas where there's high levels of risk? And should we be actually, is it sensible, and this goes right to the heart, I think, of section 7 of the report, is it sensible for council, where there has been no development, i.e. vacant sections, to actually introduce people into higher levels of risk, higher risk areas, and then try and mitigate that risk by building expensive structures above them? Or should we be actively discouraging new development from occurring in there? And I think that's a broader policy question that the council needs to grapple. And yes, it's difficult for those people who may have vacant sections, but that's the real policy issue that you're needing to address.
But where you've got adjacent residential, have you looked at, if there's vacant sections on either side or around it, whether or not the mitigation would be cost effective?
No, because there's no, we haven't. We did not include vacant sections.
Okay. And I think one thing that's hard to kind of comprehend is how the gondola can cost effectively reduce the risk to a level where they can have tourists going up the side of the Port Hills with quite extensive, landscaping and all sorts of stuff. So how can someone like the gondola cost effectively mitigate the risk that people, which I presume is, similar to what some of these properties are going through?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I don't know the gondola in detail, but the gondola or the pylons for the gondola are like any individual property. And we do offer and enable people to develop individual solutions. And individual solutions for an individual making that choice may be cost effective for them. And then that opportunity is not withdrawn in any sense by not doing area-wide mitigation. And there's nothing to stop any of the landowners who have been covered here actually accessing the individual rockfall protection structure.
Do we enable them to use our land to do that?
I'm not quite sure what our policy is. I'd have to check that, sorry, Councillor. We are open to it, Peter said.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the conversation though with Sarah, they're really clear. None of the land that they're purchasing will be able to be used for mitigation.
That's the advice.
So even though it's going to transfer to us at some stage, we have no power to do anything at the moment.
Well, I mean, I think that's correct, and the key thing becomes, again, if it's transferred to the council, does the council want that land? Is it the right thing to have that land? Is it, and we don't know what land the Crown would be prepared to transfer to us, but I think we need to come back to the issue that says, would we be transferring land to us to enable new development to go into high-risk areas?
Or mitigation to our liability.
Mitigation.
Or mitigation for our liability.
Well, you're saying it's our liability. I think that's a question that either needs to be looked at or has been looked at, as I understand, and needs some advice to you on.
Look, I think that's been incredibly useful. I've got the relevant section of the cost share agreement with me now, and the agreement in here is that the Crown agrees to transfer up to 50% of the gross land area adjoining CCC's reserves as identified by CCC to CCC at no cost. And I think the phrase is at no cost. So it doesn't say that there wouldn't be more land available to be transferred to the council, but it may be at a cost. So I don't know that there's a complete final picture in the cost share as it's defined there. But I think there are a couple of other things that we need before we make a decision on this. One is the legal advice. I think that would be incredibly useful, and I think it probably does pre-exist this council. And but if it doesn't, we can get legal advice prepared, because it would be good to understand what our liability is, especially in this uncertain environment which the residential red zone does create. So because and I think it's the difficulty that we have is that it's called a residential red zone, but it's kind of like that's just a phrase, because it's not a zone. It's not a zone that we've created. It's not a zone recognised in our district plan. And in fact, one of our challenges is going to be, how do we deal with the red zone in the district planning processes, given that it isn't currently identified as such. And that's just as true on the flatland as it is in the Port Hills. The challenge is obviously even greater, given the fact of the announcement that the Supreme Court will hear the appeal of the Quake Outcast case in July. So again, there will be a period of uncertainty. But it would be useful to have that additional report. So, I mean, I'm just wondering whether we could have a resolution rather than accept the resolution that's proposed by staff at this stage. Could we let it lie on the table till the 12th of June meeting, and then in the meantime have the additional advice to council to enable us to make a decision on it? Would that be useful, Yanni?
12th of June or 12th of May? 12th of June.
We can't possibly deal with it at the 12th of May.
That's okay. I just
given everything that is on the agenda for the 12th of May.
Yeah, I think we just need to be really clear about what additional information we're asking staff to provide, so that we don't then get a report come back and we have a whole bunch of other questions. So maybe we coordinate that through your office. So let's identify
what those are. First of all, it's the legal liability, particularly in relation to properties which have not been purchased by the Crown but are identified in their red zone and quote marks. Yep.
I think I'd like to see some more specific information in relation to the cost-benefit threshold.
Yep.
The sub-areas that were talked about that were cost-effective for mitigation, if you could use Crown land.
There's a summary at the back. page 21, which, but I have to say that when I read that, I couldn't quite. Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid that it's not clear to me what that means. So are we able to get that?
Yep, we can provide the more detailed worksheets that actually explain what inputs went in and what calculations were undertaken to get those figures. We can provide that.
That would be useful. And then in the report back also, perhaps could you, undertake to include all of the additional information you provided yesterday in response to Councillor
You mean those notes that I provided?
Yes, I think
we can write those up.
It would be useful to include those.
Sure.
Yep. And perhaps the local MP's letter and perhaps any response that's required to that. It just gets all of the issues together in one place. Yep.
Although the report is about an area-wide mitigation, in fact, the original request was in relation to communities, and it just seems to me that there's some submitters today where, in fact, they've been excluded from all of this. And I think if we could have some costings in relation to those cases, and cases like those, in fact, I think that would be really useful for us as a council and for the community. It doesn't seem to be fair or reasonable that, in fact, they be excluded on just a general basis, that, in fact, with the assumption of the area-wide thing only be applied to more than one property.
Yeah, the staff were asked to put together a paper on area-wide land mitigation, so I'm not surprised that that's the case. But is there, in the work that you've done, the identification that potentially an individual property could meet their own protection needs, and then would you have a conversation with that landowner about pursuing an individual solution?
Well, I mean, we already have a process around individual solutions, and that's been established by council, and there have been discussions with some landowners around that. Certainly, my understanding is that at least one of the people you're talking about is looking at at individual rockfall protection structures. But I think, as Don has outlined, a specific individualised what do I need to do to protect my property is quite a different conversation than actually the conversation that says if you aggregate properties together for a while. I think we're talking about the same issue, but the solutions could be quite different when you're just talking about individuals. So no, we haven't gone down to individuals, and we do have a process which allows individuals to put up cases, and we have worked with individuals who have put up cases around how they might do individual rockfall protection structure for their properties, and we're available to continue to do that.
I would just hope that process can continue, because that clearly is the concern that was expressed to us today.
Well, it's an established policy of council, so that continues, absolutely.
I'm looking at the...
So Mr. Dorman's just advised me you want to comment?
Yeah, the process exists. We're talking with people on a regular basis. There is a time limit approaching on it, in that the red zone offers have to be accepted or they expire by the 31st of August. So if people want to avail themselves of the individual rockfall protection structure funding and stay in a property, they need to get into a conversation with council quickly to get them through the process and the decision by the 31st of August. And we are talking to people on that basis literally all the time. And there's an increasing number of inquiries coming in as that date gets closer about people exploring the possibility of staying in a property with a rockfall protection structure that's part funded or funded by the council existing policy of December 2012. But what we haven't done is gone around a map around the Port Hills, identifying individual properties that could be protected and contacting the property owners and saying, you can come in here and get some funding if you want to stay there. So we've responded to inquiries coming in.
So I'm just thinking of that legal advice at the top, and it must be the lawyer coming out in me, but I wonder whether that should also be expanded to include potential liability should rockfall protection systems fail in the future. Because I have in the back of my mind, a rockfall protection measure that did fail, but it failed in the light of cliff collapse, which was not what it was designed to protect against.
Yeah.
But creating, it worries me that we create a perception of safety that may not subsequently prove to hold true, given the experience that we've been through. So I just wonder whether we could have that in there as well.
Yep.